Alright, let's start. Number 8. The Bone Wall. When archaeologists began examining the lower levels of medieval castle dungeon complexes across Western Europe in the late 20th century, they expected to find stone, mortar, and the occasional artifact. At sites including the Château de Chinon in the Loire Valley, France, and comparable fortifications from the 13th and 14th centuries, they found something else entirely. The walls themselves were not entirely stone. Medieval masons built dungeons to last. They used whatever material was available and structurally useful, and in the lower chambers, far below where records were kept or inspections conducted, that sometimes included human bone. The practice of incorporating skeletal remains into dungeon masonry, whether accidental or deliberate, is documented in chronicles from the 13th through 15th centuries, and testimony from Templar prisoners compiled during the Council of Vienne between 1311 and 1312 describes the disposal of the dead within castle walls as an understood, if unspoken, institutional practice. What disturbs historians is not simply that bodies ended up in the walls, it is the construction timeline. Forensic archaeological analysis of bone material recovered from dungeon masonry has identified individuals aged between 18 and 45, predominantly male, showing skeletal evidence of prolonged malnutrition and healed fractures consistent with captivity. In several documented cases, the surrounding mortar was not ancient when the bones were incorporated. The construction was ongoing. The bones were not relics of some distant catastrophe that builders later sealed over. They were fresh. The walls were built around people who had not been dead for long, in subterranean chambers specifically designed to ensure they would never be found. Most dungeons were built to hold the living. These walls suggest that at some point the distinction stopped mattering to the people doing the building. What else did they consider structural material? Number 7. The false wall. In 1885, renovation workers at Carlisle Castle in Cumbria, England, broke through what appeared to be a solid section of medieval stonework and discovered a cavity behind it. Inside the cavity was a skeleton. The castle, which dates to 1093 under William Rufus and was expanded significantly through the 13th and 15th centuries, had held Scottish prisoners following the Battle of Solway Moss in 1542 and briefly confined Mary Queen of Scots in 1568. This skeleton belonged to none of those periods. It was older. The cavity had not been sealed from the outside by accident. Its dimensions and construction indicated deliberate design, a space built to be invisible from both the dungeon side and the corridor side, with interior walls of finished stone rather than rough fill. Records held at the Cumbria Archive Center document the discovery, though the identity of the individual inside was never established. What the cavity revealed was its own internal logic. The space was precisely large enough to contain one person in a crouched or fetal position, but not large enough to stand, turn around, or fully extend the limbs. The stonework on the interior surfaces bore marks consistent with repeated scraping, not tool marks from construction. Something made by fingers, over time, against finished stone. Historians examining similar discoveries at other sites in northern England have noted that the false wall is architecturally distinct from the oubliette or the sealed vault. It required the cooperation of construction workers, guards, and administrators across an extended period. It was not an improvised solution. It was a planned one, with the person inside apparently written out of the record before the mortar was dry. Carlisle Castle is a tourist site today. The renovation workers who broke through that wall in 1885 were not looking for anything. The person inside had been there, by the castle's own architectural evidence, for centuries. Whether anyone heard them while they were making those marks on the stone is a question the walls have kept entirely to themselves. Number 6. Black Water. At the base of Gravenstein Castle in Ghent, Belgium, there is a chamber that medieval authorities referred to in their administrative records simply as the lower dungeon. The castle was constructed in 1180 by Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders, and served as an official judicial prison for the county of Flanders throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. The lower dungeon sits below the castle's water table. The floor floods. It always has. Gravenstein's civic archives document more than 200 named prisoners across the 13th and 14th centuries, of whom fewer than 40 appear in any record of release. The castle exchanged hands repeatedly, but the lower chamber remained in continuous use regardless of who controlled it. Medieval physicians who examined survivors, where survivors existed, documented symptoms that modern medicine would classify as peripheral vasoconstriction, hypothermia, and the early stages of immersion foot syndrome, a condition of tissue death caused by prolonged exposure to cold standing water. There was no raised surface inside the lower dungeon. No shelf, no ledge, no platform built into the original design. A person placed inside stood in water, knelt in water, or eventually collapsed into it. Archaeological excavations of the chamber conducted in the 20th century recovered something unexpected from the floor. However, fragments of shaped stone and rubble that had not fallen from the walls. They had been stacked, deliberately, by someone who had been inside long enough to attempt engineering. The stacked rubble showed evidence of more than one construction phase. The arrangement had been built, partially collapsed or dismantled, and rebuilt in a slightly different configuration, which means the problem had been worked on across more than one period of occupancy, passed from one prisoner to the next like inherited knowledge. Someone taught the next prisoner how to build a platform in a flooding room. Someone else improved it. The water kept rising regardless. The question is not how long it took the water to win. The question is how many people tried to beat it before it did. Number 5. No bottom. An oubliette takes its name from the French verb oublier, to forget. The name is not metaphorical. It is a description of intended function. At Château de Chinon in the Dordogne Valley of France, a 12th century fortress that changed hands 11 times during the Hundred Years' War between 1337 and 1453, the oubliette descends approximately 9 meters through solid rock. The opening at the top measures roughly 80 centimeters in diameter. A falling adult cannot spread their arms wide enough to slow their descent. The castle is one of the most extensively documented dungeon sites in western France, and contemporary accounts from both French and English occupation periods confirm the oubliette's use across multiple generations of military administration. A person dropped from the top would impact the bottom at a speed sufficient to cause severe skeletal fractures, particularly to the feet, ankles, and lower legs, but not sufficient to guarantee immediate death. Forensic reconstructions modeling survival time for an uninjured prisoner without water in a sealed 9-meter shaft suggest a window of 3 to 5 days. The oubliette at Castelnau contains prisoner carvings at multiple points along its interior walls. This is not unusual. What is unusual is where the lowest carvings are, not at the point of impact, not scratched in desperation, just above the floor. The lowest confirmed carvings are positioned at a height that would require the person making them to have been in a state of deliberate composure in near total darkness, with whatever they used to carve pressed against the stone by sustained, patient effort. The carvings at the bottom are not distress marks. They are detailed. Archaeologists who have descended into the oubliette with climbing equipment have not reached a consensus on what the images represent. They were made by someone who had accepted their situation well enough to do careful work. They carved something at the bottom of a hole that was built to be forgotten. We still don't know what they were trying to say, or who they thought might one day descend far enough to read it. Number 4. The Iron Bed. In the dungeon records of European Inquisition facilities from the 14th through the 16th centuries, there exists a category of confinement instrument that appears in inventories not alongside torture implements, but alongside furniture. The iron bed was listed as a fixture. At Inquisition sites whose records are preserved at the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, iron restraint frames appear in administrative inventories as permanent installations rather than equipment brought in for specific sessions. They were not for questioning, they were for housing. The distinction matters. A device used in sessions produces injury and then ends. A device used for housing produces a different kind of outcome entirely. Henry Charles Lea, whose 3-volume study, A History of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages, was published in 1888 and remains a foundational scholarly text, identified the iron restraint bed as unusual among medieval punitive devices, specifically because its mechanism of harm was biological rather than mechanical. The body, held in a single position without relief, destroys itself. Within 2 to 3 weeks of complete immobilization, pressure necrosis develops at contact points, progressing through skin and muscle to bone. Deep vein thrombosis follows. Without intervention, sepsis from infected pressure wounds becomes fatal within weeks to months. The timeline is not speculative. It is documented in post-Inquisition medical testimony and corroborated by modern clinical literature on immobility-related injury. The iron bed did not require anyone to return to the prisoner. It required only that no one did. Several documented iron restraint bed designs include a drainage feature built into the frame itself. This was not a modification added later. It was part of the original construction, present in the initial design. Someone calculated, at the drawing stage, that drainage would be necessary for long-term use. Someone drew that channel into the design before the frame was built. They were imagining a specific duration of occupation when they did it. The records do not tell us whose face they pictured. They tell us only that they planned ahead. Number 3, the last sentence. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, issued a series of administrative directives to the wardens of royal prison facilities in connection with the suppression of the Knights Templar. The arrest orders are well known to historians. The torture authorizations are documented. What receives less attention is a subset of directives held in the Archives nationales de France that specified how condemned prisoners were to be informed of their fate. They were to be told that their sentence had been determined. Nothing further was to be communicated. This practice, which historians of medieval incarceration now identify as deliberate indefinite sentencing, was not limited to the Templar suppression. The Venetian Council of Ten maintained a parallel administrative tradition across the 14th through 16th centuries, documented in the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, in which prisoner files were annotated with sentences that were never formally communicated to the condemned. The prisoner knew that a decision had been made. They did not know what it was. They did not know when it would happen. Testimony from Templar survivors compiled during the Council of Vienne between 1311 and 1312 and preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Archive describes the psychological landscape of this practice with striking consistency. Prisoners did not know whether they would be released tomorrow or executed next week, or left indefinitely. The uncertainty was not an administrative oversight. Contemporary psychological research on populations held under indeterminate sentences, including work published in academic literature on solitary confinement and detention, confirms that the absence of a known endpoint produces measurably greater psychological deterioration than a fixed sentence, including a fixed death sentence. James B. Given, in his 1997 study, Inquisition and Medieval Society, published by Cornell University Press, identifies the withholding of sentence information as a deliberate and systematically applied practice across multiple medieval European judicial systems. This was not chaos. It was a procedure. Someone wrote it down. Someone trained wardens to follow it. The records knew what the sentence was. They were always going to outlast the people they described. Some of those prisoners died in their cells not knowing whether freedom or execution was coming for them. The archive held the answer the entire time, in a language the prisoner could not access, and a building they would never leave. Number 2. Buried alive. In 1241, a Hungarian noblewoman named Hedvig of Silesia, later canonized as Saint Hedwig, petitioned the court of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II on behalf of a prisoner discovered alive inside a sealed sub-vault beneath a castle in Silesia. The man had been placed there, according to the court's own documentation, as part of a formal judicial sentence. By the time he was found, according to the records compiled during Hedwig's canonization process, filed with the Vatican in 1267 and corroborated by the 14th century chronicle known as the Chronica Principum Poloniae, he had been inside for approximately 11 years. Sub-vault imprisonment was architecturally distinct from other forms of medieval dungeon confinement. The space was not a cell, it was a chamber below the cell level, designed in its original construction for a different purpose, sealed from above by a removable stone mechanism that was not accessible from the interior. A prisoner placed inside could not stand fully upright, could not turn around comfortably, and had no means of signaling their presence to the floors above. The chamber's continued existence in the record depended entirely on someone on the outside choosing to remember it. The court physicians who examined the man after his discovery documented his condition in terms that align across 7 centuries of medical progress with what modern neuroscience would identify as severe sensory deprivation syndrome. He had lost the ability to speak. He could not maintain an upright posture. He showed no recognition of faces or language. He had survived on groundwater, draining through the vault floor and whatever organic matter the darkness provided. He relearned standing the way an infant does, from the beginning. What the canonization record reveals, and what no subsequent historical commentary has fully accounted for, is that when the original sentencing document was located following the discovery, it specified a term of 5 years. The sentence had expired 6 years before anyone went back for him. Dr. Albrecht Klassen, a medievalist at the University of Arizona, who has written extensively on violence in captivity in medieval institutional settings, notes that this category of administrative failure, a prisoner serving years beyond their legal sentence, appears in multiple judicial records from this period, generally without annotation or formal acknowledgement. The record of his original sentence still exists. The record of his discovery still exists. Between them, there is a gap of 6 years and no explanation. That gap is not a mystery of history. It is a document of indifference, preserved in the same archive as the sentence it outlived, and it remains one of the most quietly harrowing things that medieval record-keeping has ever produced. Number 1. The Thing. In 1899, during excavations beneath the former Inquisition prison complex at Carcassonne in southern France, a section of the sub-complex floor gave way and revealed a chamber that appeared on no blueprint, no warden's ledger, and no surviving administrative document from any period of the facility's operation. The Carcassonne Inquisition had been established in 1229 following the Albigensian Crusade and remained operationally documented through the 15th century. The excavation team, working under the direction of conservators continuing the restoration legacy of architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, submitted their report to what is now held at the Médiathèque de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine in Paris. The report noted the chamber's existence. It did not have a classification for it. The chamber measured approximately 2.1 meters in length, 0.9 meters in width, and 1.4 meters in height. One person could exist inside it. They could not stand upright. They could not fully extend their body lengthwise. They could not turn around without deliberate contortion. The ceiling was composed of a single, large, removable stone. No mechanism for moving that stone existed within the chamber. Access was possible only from above, by someone on the outside, which meant that anyone placed inside had no means of departure that did not depend entirely on the willingness of someone else to provide it. The floor of the chamber contained a layer of dark organic material. Analysis conducted in the latter half of the 20th century identified the material as decomposed human tissue, hair, and fragmented bone. The remains represented more than one individual. The chamber had not been used once. It had been used, emptied in some fashion, and used again. Henry Charles Lay, whose foundational 3-volume History of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages was published 11 years before the chamber's discovery in 1888, observed in his comparative analysis of Inquisition facilities that Carcassonne was notable for the complete absence of recorded prisoner escape attempts across its operational history. Leah attributed this to institutional discipline and the thoroughness of the facility's containment procedures. The chamber, undiscovered when he wrote that observation, suggests a more subterranean explanation. The Inquisition at Carcassonne recorded everything. Confessions were transcribed in full. Sentences were logged with dates and authorizing signatures. Recantations were filed. The names of the dead were preserved. The chamber that collapsed into view in 1899 does not appear in any of it. Not as a disciplinary measure. Not as a holding space. Not as an architectural feature. Not as an entry in a construction ledger. It was built by people who knew how to keep records, inside an institution whose survival depended on documentation, and they chose to leave no record of it whatsoever. Whatever happened in that space, the people responsible for it understood from the beginning that it needed to exist outside the written world entirely. They were right. It took 6 centuries and a collapsed floor for anyone to find it. And even now, with the chamber measured and analyzed and filed in a Parisian archive, we know only that it held people, that they did not leave on their own, and that someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that we would never know anything more than that. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.